Welcome to Ilsley Public Library. My name's Chris Kirby. I'm the Adult Services and Technology Librarian here at Ilsley. And I'd like to, first of all, thank the following sponsors for helping bring the First Wednesday series to Ilsley. Our statewide underwriter is the Institute of Museum and Library Services through the Department of Libraries in Vermont. Our series underwriter, the residents at Otter Creek, and our library sponsor, the Friends of Ilsley Public Library. I would also like to welcome Steve Viner, the faculty co-director of the Engaged Listening Project at Middlebury College, which co-sponsors many of the talks in the First Wednesday series along with the Vermont Humanities Council. And tonight, Steve will introduce our speaker.
Hi. Right, so I'm Steve Viner. I teach in the philosophy department at Middlebury College. It's great, it's wonderful. And one of the things that I also do is I'm director of the Engaged Listening Project, where we help faculty and students and staff think about listening and thinking about engagement in the classroom. And we're also partly, so we co-sponsor or have a partnership with the Vermont Humanities Council. And so sometimes we help bring the First Wednesday speakers here, but we also bring them to campus. And so there'll be at least 2 next year to campus, which you are totally welcome to come. They are open to the public, and we love it when people from the community come and engage with students. So it's just awesome. It's a great opportunity for students, and hopefully a good opportunity for you. But to have a different kind of engagement, to have that engagement as we bring the speakers. So I just wanted to put in a little plug for First Wednesdays here, but First Wednesdays when they come to Middlebury College, when they come to the campus too. You're all welcome. For sure. And so I have the pleasure of introducing, I'm so part of the Engaged Listening Project as a sponsor for this event, as well as the Mellon Foundation. The Mellon Foundation gives us a grant at Middlebury College to help bring speakers here and help us think about how we engage with them. So as that, I get to introduce Whitney, your speaker for tonight. Whitney Kimball Coe is Director of National Programs for the Center of Rural Strategies and also serves as a coordinator of the Rural Assembly, a rural movement made up of activities and partnerships geared towards building better policy and more opportunity across the country. The Center for Rural Strategies is a nonprofit that seeks to improve economic and social conditions for marginalized communities in the countryside and around the world through creative and innovative use of media and communications. Whitney began working with this center as a consultant to the Community Philanthropy Initiative and now focuses on national strategies for strengthening and amplifying the work of rural advocates and stakeholders. Over the years, Whitney has built partnerships with national public interest organizations, funders, and grassroots organizers in ways that have informed public policy and private investment in rural people and places. So in 2017, Whitney was featured speaker in the inaugural summit of the Obama Foundation and a guest speaker on the radio program On Being with Krista Tippett. Her focus on building civic courage in communities is directly tied to a practice of participation in her hometown of Athens, Tennessee, where she serves on multiple boards as a fitness instructor at the Athens McMinn YMCA and as a weekly columnist for the local newspaper, the Daily Post-Athenian. She has a master's degree in Appalachian Studies, I think is the way to say that. Thank you. Yeah, sorry. Sorry. The word came out at me at the page really quick. Appalachian State University in North Carolina. And so she has an undergraduate degree in religion and philosophy from Queen's University of Charlotte, not Charlotte. That's up here. Another word, Charlotte. But if you could, let's thank Whitney for coming.
Thank you for listening to me. I figure I might talk for about 40 minutes, and then I want us to have some time for some Q&A and conversation. And I'm going to start with a story something that I wrote back in 2017. So I just invite you to listen, and I'll try to read slowly and thoughtfully. Last Thursday night, I found myself wondering if life could get more precious than this. My 6-year-old daughter, Lucy, stood next to me on an old yoga mat, holding steady in warrior pose, while my mother looked on from her mat a few feet away. In front of us, our instructor, Brad, smiled as he watched Lucy concentrate. Her tongue was balanced on her lower lip. Brad is 40 years old, part Texan, part Canadian, and by day, a bus driver for our region's social services agency. He got yoga certified a couple of years ago and teaches our little class in Julie and Jerry's Art and Frame Shop on North Jackson Street in downtown Athens. We sit on the stoop outside of Art and Frame every Thursday night and wait for Julie to unlock the door. I started bringing Lucy because I love the feel of this space and the closeness of our group, and I wanted Lucy to get a glimpse of how we make things happen in Athens. We use what we have, and most of the time we have what we need. In this case, a Sethra bus driver, mats, and a solid floor beneath us. In my early 20s, I lived in a big city, and my yoga experience was much more complicated. It involved expensive, stretchy pants, and a monthly membership fee, and a brand-named water bottle, and many, many mirrors. There were no floor-length mirrors at Art and Frame. There are no smooth, windowless walls, only exposed brick and mortar, and Brad just asked us to stick a few dollars in a tin can on our way out. All around us, hanging in the shadows, are newly framed pictures, many of them by beloved local artists. As I change positions, I can see floating between my legs and upside down Betty Grader's watercolor of her grandchildren, Emily and Katie. Some of Julie's pieces are nearby. These are artful tangles of found objects brought together on canvases and pieces of wood from her backyard. On this Thursday night, holding the warrior pose, Lucy doesn't know that life could be any different. She probably assumes that all Sethra bus drivers are yoga instructors, and that this type of gathering naturally occurs in frame shops all over the country and no matter where you live. Her world is small and connected, and her days are a flurry of interactions with people she knows in a variety of settings and capacities, from church to school to the grocery store. She doesn't know that she's part of creating something everywhere she goes. Just her presence and her participation in this room is a life-giving force. Her round, confident face and blue eyes tell us that we're creating something wonderful in this room. I wonder if there will come a time when those eyes will dim a little bit and she'll look around and ask me why we chose to live in this small, backward-ass town. If she follows in my footsteps, her dissatisfaction will begin around middle school and reach a fever pitch by her senior year. She'll apply to colleges in urban big cities, and she'll declare her interest in international studies. And maybe like me, she'll arrive in a big city and discover a kind of loneliness that hurts so badly it brings you to your knees. Maybe not. But if she does, that loneliness might fuel that flame inside her, and she'll start to re-examine her memories of our yoga nights here at Art and Frame. She'll look back on us gathered there, surrounded by Betty Grader paintings and Julie's monster mermaids and wood creations, and decide that she wants that again for herself and for the people she loves. Or maybe she'll never question why we're so devoted to this small and imperfect town. But looking at her on this Thursday night with her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth, I sense that she knows how precious this is. Thank you all for listening to that. That was I was trying to think of how to introduce myself, and sometimes I get tired of the same way of telling your story. You need different ways of telling your story, and I think my story these days is about being a young mother raising young children in a small town, in the town that I grew up in and decided to come back to after spending many years away, having my education in a big city somewhere, studying international studies at first, and then finding the religion and philosophy department and realizing that that's where I belonged. So my name's Whitney Kimball Coe. In Athens, I introduced myself as Andrew's sister, and Ellen and Art's daughter, and George and Mary Ellen's granddaughter. And I used to go to Trinity United Methodist Church, but now we go to St. Paul's Episcopal, and don't get me started on why we made that switch. It's just like the history in a small town, right, is very long, and people remember you, and they know the pews that you sit in, and they know how often you go to church. And if you've got one grocery store and one library and one softball field and just one institution of everything, then you are known to your neighbors. And that was something that was very difficult for me about middle school and about high school, and me thinking that I needed to be able to spread my wings and find myself, which isn't a bad thing. But like I said in that essay, when I got out into the world to Queens College in Charlotte, and then I spent time at Appalachian State, and then some time in New York City, it was like calling to me was this idea of community, and this sense that having those long-term relationships and that long history is something that's precious and something that we need right now, perhaps, in this moment of great polarization and division, and a feeling of disconnect from where we belong and who we belong with. So I ended up moving back home. And that all started in 2008 when I was hired by the Center for Rural Strategies. And I didn't know that I grew up in a rural town, to be honest. How many of you all claim to be from rural or are from a rural place? Yes? Oh, wonderful. How many of you all still live in a rural place? Oh, that's so great. That's so great. So like I said, I didn't know what rural meant, and I never would have categorized myself that way. Maybe I would have said, yeah, I live in the Appalachian region. Athens, Tennessee is about an hour south of Knoxville, an hour north of Chattanooga. We're about an hour and a half from Dolly Parton's homestead and Dollywood, which I have a season pass to. So I felt an affinity to the Appalachian culture, but I don't think I really understood that there is some unspoken and sometimes spoken divide between living in a small town and a big city. I knew that there were differences, but I never really categorized myself that way. But there happens to be a whole sector of people who live and work and breathe rural America. There's a whole sector of people who work on policy for rural America. There's a whole sector of people who talk about it day in and day out and are writing articles and creating media and trying to insert rural interests into national conversations. But I didn't know that sector existed until 2008, and I was hired by Rural Strategies to be a program associate and to help them figure out how do we organize or bring together rural leaders from across the country, from all 50 states. And what would they talk about? Could they find common purpose and common voice? And that's how the Rural Assembly was born. Excuse me. Oh, this is my family. We're a bunch of superheroes in Athens, Tennessee. Athens is a population of about 13,000 people, which is up just a little bit from when I was growing up. But still, I feel like we share all these common spaces. So you know when your neighbor's hurting, and you know when your neighbor's done wrong, and you hold on to grudges perhaps longer than you should, but that's also part of your long-term story. So Rural Strategies, I was just getting to, whoops. We were founded in 2001. The idea behind Rural Strategies was that rural communities in general are overlooked by our national media, by our policymakers, and really in all things that we consider culturally important and all the things that we consider politically important, rural communities are either stereotyped or overlooked. And so Rural Strategies is here to try to remedy that situation and improve the economic and social outcomes for rural communities by offering up new and nuanced stories about rural places. So if you came tonight thinking that I was going to talk mostly about agriculture or about even CSAs, we'll get to CSAs, but or living on the land, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that, but we can still have that conversation later. What I'm here to talk about really is about cultural identity and how rural fits into the national cultural identity that we're creating right now, and how can we perhaps reconnect with rural places as places of opportunity and new futures for our nation and for ourselves. This is our rural strategies team. We're very small and we're very spread out. And something I love about rural strategies is that we're encouraged to live in our hometowns or in our rural places. As long as we have broadband, we can dial in and figure out how to work together. I was not able to move back to Athens right away because we didn't have broadband, like 25% of the rural population out there, more so if you live in a place of a community of mostly people of color. But in 2012, we got broadband in Athens. So I was able to move home and start living my life there. And that's what most of these folks are doing. They come from Lexington, Kentucky. They come from Westford, Vermont. Anybody familiar with Westford? My friend Kim Finney lives there. We have a person from California, someone from Illinois, Minnesota, let's see, and someplace outside of DC. So we have a pretty cute and precious team that works from their hometowns. In 2017, I got a call from President Obama's office saying, we're going to start a foundation that is looking at civic leaders and civic engagement, and how do we build up civic leaders in their place. And we've heard about the work that Center for Rural Strategy is doing, and I think you'd be a good keynote for the opening of the Obama Foundation Summit. And I was like, I have no idea who recommended us. If you're in this room, please raise your hand and tell me. But I got to give a keynote right before President Obama, and on the way out, I run into him, and I got to shake his hand, and he said, I'll see you at dinner tonight. And I was like, okay, that sounds great. And we actually sat next to each other at dinner. And so I got to talk about rural America for about an hour to President Obama. I didn't eat anything. There's no way I could have eaten anything. But the main message, it was the first time I had been asked why I thought rural places matter, why I'd moved back to my hometown, and what the promise is that I think goes untapped right now. And I think that's where I kind of formulated this idea of showing up, participating, and committing to a place is something that we do in small towns. In a way, it's because we don't have any alternative. And that's perhaps the negative side of it, but the positive side is that we develop this practice of participation, which is something that I think the world needs in this moment of individualism and need for control. I think the opposite of control, perhaps, is participation. So that was the first time I got to kind of articulate this idea. And I'm really grateful to the Obama Foundation Summit for giving me that opportunity. And after that, the Daily Post-Athenian in my very conservative hometown, knowing that I have very progressive views, gave me a column in the newspaper. And this is how small things lead to big outcomes. And so now for the past 4 years, I've been writing a weekly column in my very conservative newspaper that promotes kind of a progressive ideology and understanding of connectedness in the world and a vision of inclusiveness in small towns. So I'm feeling very fortunate about that. The other thing that's really wonderful about the work that I get to do these days is that I get to connect with all these people across rural America, all these leaders, people who live in very different places from me. Athens, Tennessee is very much located in the heart of the conservative South, but many of the people I work with are located, all over the place, from the border in Texas, Mexico area, to the Delta, to the plains, the Great Plains, and the Pacific Northwest. There's so many different leaders who are focused on coming home and initiating change in their communities, or putting down roots in their hometowns or in small communities and starting a different kind of life. The other thing that Rural Strategies does, and I won't say too much about this, but I wanted to let you know, is that we have a daily newspaper online. It's called the Daily Yonder, and if you go to dailyyonder.com, then you'll get the latest story, which is about, it's very much focused on rural news, rural commentary, rural analysis, and it tries to embed whatever the national focus is into a rural context. So right now the coronavirus is making everyone wring their hands, including people in small towns. How is it going to affect us? Of course, today, what we find, or what we've learned, is that rural areas are at less risk at this point around coronavirus, and of course that's because of our lack of population density and perhaps lack of mobility in some cases. So when we talk about rural America, what are we saying? This is not a political map, and I'm sorry the colors are really not helpful here. Just pretend like that's pink and purple or something. So rural America is about 80% of our land mass, and that includes Alaska and some parts of Hawaii. Does anybody know what the most rural state is? Yeah? Vermont and Maine, yes. Maine really, but Vermont's a close second. Absolutely. So 80% of our land mass, about 20% of our population, 20% of our population. So the way that rural is defined, it varies across different agencies, but a good rule of thumb, USDA uses the 50,000 threshold population. 50,000 or less is about rural. There's also new designations around micro communities, micropolitan communities versus metro communities, those kinds of things. Athens, Tennessee is about here. So we're solidly considered rural, but we're close to a metropolitan area, which is, or well, a smaller metropolitan area, which is Knox County. So we might be considered micropolitan. So there are different ways of measuring it, but 50,000 is a pretty good rule. But 50,000 covers a very diverse set of rural communities, right? So if you go out here to the west, you might find populations of 91 people. And if you are here in Athens, Tennessee, you'll have 13,000. That's a very different experience. So in a lot of ways, rural gets compressed, just like all other important topics these days. It gets compressed into a very simplified definition, but we know that rural America is incredibly diverse. Whoops. So actually, it's only 14 percentage points less diverse than urban, and it's on the same trajectory as all other places in the country, that it's growing in terms of diversity. So some of these pictures are from places that I visited over the last 12 years. There's an incredible Muslim community outside of Morgantown, West Virginia. The Fisher community that's in Alaska, it's a native community. There are folks in the Delta, people of color certainly in the Delta, and then there are a number of Hmong communities in Minnesota and in the Great Plains. Asian Americans are the fastest growing demographic in the Great Plains area, which is very interesting. So rural America is often typecast as a place of white Americans mostly, but in fact it is very, very diverse. Before I get to that slide, let me just ask you all, when you think about rural America, what sort of images or stories or thoughts come to mind? Farmer, the farmer? Yeah, for sure. Anything else? Yes?
Rundown, threadbare, and abandoned towns.
Yes, absolutely.
Big trucks.
Big trucks. Like, you mean like 18-wheelers or like coal trucks or?
Texas.
Oh, okay. Big pickup trucks, okay. Gotcha. Main Street, yeah, that's neat. That's great. When I started giving talks about rural America about 10 years ago, most people would tell me silos, farmers, gardening, pastoral kind of picturesque place, or they would say abandoned, rundown, threadbare, dying places. And both of those are still true. Those are not untrue stories about rural places, but they are, of course, are compressed stories about rural places, and they miss a lot of the nuance and complexity of small towns. Only about 2% of our country is engaged in farming as a full-time job. That's where their full salary comes from, only about 2%, which is very small. And many pastoral places in rural America, though they still exist, are now places of recreation, less places of, working farms or necessarily where our small farmers are able to make a living. And those abandoned places, those certainly exist, and rural communities are dying every day. That is a truism, but there are others that are poised to turn the corner. And that's a story we don't hear so much about. But most of the news media that we see at this point, and certainly several years ago, was very much focused on one of the two extremes. And that's just a very convenient way to frame a story about a small place. And lately, those single stories have been about rural as a place that is Trump country or has harmed the nation in some way by the way we've voted or the way we've calculated our political interests. So most of the stories you see now in national news are, either about we need to get real about how rural America's failing, rural economies are falling apart, Trump country. Did anybody get that, New Yorker? When that came in my mailbox, I was like, oh my God. So this dude is right next to a car with a gun and a Trump sticker, and they're just trying to recreate. And there's some truth to all of this. I live in a small conservative town, and just before I came here tonight, one of my best friends called me to tell me she and her family are moving to Nashville because their young daughter, who's coming out, trying to come out, does not feel supported or connected in our small town. And that's very real. So trying to navigate the cultural identities of a place and move on into, what is the future for all these places, it's all very real right now. But it is complex and nuanced. And so Rural Strategies is very focused on figuring out how to tell stories of rural emergence, rural diversity, rural resilience, and also many of the progressive folks who are moving back to small towns are ready to tell their story about what they see as possible. But like I said, rural America is poorer, sicker, less connected. Some of these statistics are really troubling. I will say they're not much better. Many of them are not much better in the big cities. 1 in 4 children live in poverty. I think nationwide it's 1 in 5. In my own hometown, it's more than 1 in 4. It's 1 in 3. There is a housing crisis in small towns, but there's a housing crisis everywhere right now. Employment is not back from the 2008 recession, and that's true everywhere as well. Health is a real concern in rural places. We don't have the same access to hospitals, maternal health. There are definitely food deserts, and addiction is an issue. So all those things are also true in urban centers to some extent, but it's just more true in rural places. Broadband is a huge issue, and we've not been able to meet the demand that we were as a country able to meet in the 1930s and 40s when we electrified rural America. We just haven't found the political will yet, I think, to figure out how to connect everyone. And then this is a huge deal. 6 to 7% of philanthropic dollars make it to rural places, and I told you that 20% of our population lives in rural America, and yet only 6 to 7% of our philanthropic dollars are making it there. And then there's all this lack of capital from bank deserts and the consolidation of small banks into bigger, larger banks in urban centers. So these are all very real issues that we're dealing with right now. But some of the reasons why I moved back to my hometown is that I sensed a need for connection and community, and I know that that's something that we have in spades, and we're learning how to get better at. Our lack of access in some ways to technology and to other services makes us turn inward in a way that is often creates very innovative responses that are built on civic and social capital. So a recent poll from Harvard and NPR showed that a majority of people who live in small towns are optimistic that they can make an impact in their community. And we know that we've got good leadership there and no lack of ideas. And then there's this group of homecomers, people I've been calling homecomers. I think that term came from Wendell Berry, and it's 30 and 40-year-olds who are trying to build a new quality of life outside of these urban centers where they're being priced out, where their kids are not being able to get to the schools that they want them to go to, and they're trying to build a whole new life for themselves that is affordable and a good quality of life. And not only are they doing that, but they're taking the leadership skills that they've learned through their work in urban centers, and they're applying them to small town experience and showing up on boards, on city councils and county commissions in really positive ways. The other thing that's really good to note here is that, like I said, rural America is really diverse. Appalachia, for instance, is very dependent on coal, or has been for many decades and centuries even. And now they're working on what's the next iteration of coal. If there's no coal jobs in Appalachia anymore, what are we going to do? So they're calling that just transition work. So there's a lot of organizing going on around that. In the Midwest, there's a lot of organizing by farm workers and immigrants to carve out spaces in these small communities to have new businesses, to create small farms and CSAs. A community-supported agriculture. So you can participate as a member of that and pay dues, and you get some of the produce, and sometimes you do some of the work itself, right? Arts and culture and placemaking, you all are probably very familiar with that. That has taken real root in small towns and main streets. Somebody mentioned main streets. Main street programs have been really beneficial for rural communities across the country because they've opened up grant dollars for people to invest in the culture of their place by bringing out the arts and creating jobs that way. Recreation, green energy, off-the-grid lifestyles, this has been very interesting to watch, especially in the Southwest and in New England too. And then there's this whole idea that rural America is the next cool place, which I'm happy, I believe that, but at the same time I don't want everybody to move there because it's supposed to be somewhat of a secret. But it is a cool place, and it's a place where that's a little bit malleable right now because it's on the cusp of what's next, the future of work, the future of how we're going to be together in these small towns. So that brings me to the main piece of work that I get to do on a daily basis, which is to bring all these rural leaders together from 50 states and all backgrounds and experiences to come and talk about what are the challenges they're facing, what are their hopes for the future, what are the things that are working or not working in their places. And through that, some things that have emerged have been really powerful. Like we created a broadband working group that was very instrumental in the previous administration to change the FEC regulations around who is entitled to broadband. And I don't know if you all remember, but during the Obama administration, they designated broadband as a Title II utility, which is the same thing as electricity or utilities in general, and which meant that everyone's supposed to have access to them. Unfortunately, with this new administration, that's been pushed to the side, but we were a huge voice in that conversation, and that was really powerful. Another thing we've discovered is that rural women in particular are the keepers of community memory and leadership and know-how around organizing, and we've been able to form this kind of cohort of rural women and that we're calling the Rural Women's Summit. We had a really wonderful gathering of those folks not too long ago, and I'm going to show you a video from that. And then finally, this idea about rural young people, people who are growing up in small towns, feeling isolated, perhaps feeling like they're not supported as they're coming into their own and their identity, and also with this kind of implicit knowledge that getting out is success, is what success looks like from a rural place. So how do we reshape that for them, help them find their allies in small towns, help them create their own vehicles for leadership in small towns. That's something that's been really powerful and exciting to work on. So we're having a youth assembly coming up in April in McAllen, Texas, which is right on the border. It's right next to the border wall. We're doing a lot of work with small organizations there to expose these young people to kind of what's happening on the border and also what civic engagement in a very intense situation can look like. So modeling that for them on the border. So these are some of the women I get to work with on a daily basis. It's really incredible. This woman is Native American from Minnesota. This woman's from the border, from Washington State, Kentucky. This is my daughter, that's my daughter, that's my goddaughter. These are some of the women I work with on our Main Street project in Athens. So one of the great things about my life right now is that I'm getting to practice locally what I'm experimenting with nationally, or experiment locally what I'm trying to create nationally with other people. And that's been really powerful. So this is a group of women that I've known all my life. This woman was my mentor in high school. This woman was the children's choir director when I was growing up, and this is my godsister who's now the director of the Arts Center in Athens, which my mother founded. So, you know, those relationships, they're not for nothing, right? All right, so I wanted to show you a quick video of a speech that this young woman gave. I think it gives you a nice overview of where rural America is in the national dialogue and how emerging leaders are trying to push back on narratives of despair and disparity.
I, to everyday small-town rural citizens, wrote a feverish response that went internationally viral within minutes, and how I believe that we don't need to choose between what makes us happy and whole and what can change the world. I was 6 months pregnant with my first son, and the holidays were coming. Getting ready to be a new mom had me reflecting a lot about my personal values and whether I was truly living them out. I had recently vowed to make more space in my life for those values, specifically creative writing. I realized that despite my efforts to create generative feminist processes of rural community development, I had depleted myself by conforming to patriarchal notions of leadership. I was trying to be in charge of everything. I was pushing my ideas onto other people, and I was choosing work before health, well-being, and my creative practice. So in December, I resigned from several community boards and committees, and I gave myself permission to rest and step back. I remember saying to myself many times, your writing can be your activism, but I wasn't quite sure what that looked like yet. One morning, I was having coffee with a friend when my phone buzzed. I glanced and saw there was a tweet from our city administrator. Not a normal thing to have him contact me that way, but I ignored it until I was walking to my office. Then I opened up my phone and saw a headline in German that translated to, "A Der Spiegel reporter has manipulated his own stories to a large extent." I knew in that moment that my life was about to change. My slow, pregnant walk in the snow turned into a jog and then a sprint to my office. I burst through the front door and ran straight to my desk, frantically plugging in my computer. The headlines blurred in front of me. I scanned frantically through a rough translation of an article which explained that Klaus Rolodius, an award-winning reporter from the high-profile German magazine Der Spiegel, had resigned after being caught by his colleague for fabricating not one, but dozens of his articles. My friend Jake and I were texting frantically. You see, Rolodius had visited our town for 5 weeks, almost a year ago, and then he had published a lengthy article about us that was titled, "Where They Pray for Trump on Sundays." His article wasn't just biased, it was complete fiction. It's true, we live in a conservative area, so there's plenty of real stories he could have covered to tell the story he came to find. But for some reason, he had gone through the trouble of making everything up. He painted the picture of a bleak, isolated town that has no access to national news and is obsessed with the movie American Sniper. He described a welcome sign with stars and stripes that does not exist. And he crafted complete lies about people in our town, including the owner of our Mexican restaurant, who he said was dying of kidney disease. She's not. And voted for Trump. She didn't. And our city administrator, Andrew, who carries a gun, He doesn't, and has a stuffed wild boar in his office. Nope. Over the last few months, Jake and I had been crafting a response in a shared Google Doc, fact-checking every strange little anecdote by talking to the individuals he had profiled. We were in a holding pattern with a near-final draft, trying to figure out how and when to share it. We had no idea, writing this rebuttal, that we were about to get involved with an international media scandal. Back at my office that December when the news broke, the baby in my belly was doing backflips as I scanned our draft, getting the essay ready to post. I remember hesitating on the closing few paragraphs, which were in my voice. How do you defend your community against fake news without resorting to blind Pollyanna boosterism? I started to delete some of the sentences where I shared the raw sadness and frustration I had felt since the 2016 election, not understanding how the region I lived in could vote so strongly for a racist, sexist leader. But my friend Jake stopped me. Michelle, you're a young female community leader and you're about to raise a child here. You are completely entitled to say what you think. He's a good friend. So I hit post and tweeted the article out. The rest of the day is surreal. Part of me sort of hoped our little article would just dissolve into the social media void. But the opposite happened. The post went from 1,000 views to 15,000 to 30,000 in a matter of hours. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune called, the New York Times called, and then starting around 3:30 a.m. the next morning when Europe was waking up, there was requests every 5 minutes. The BBC, German Public Radio, NPR, the CBC, Huffington Post, Fox News, and dozens more. Jake and I met up at my office at Sunrise and took interviews until dinner time. The next day, a new reporter from Der Spiegel arrived in town to clean up the mess and apologize. The media inquiries went on for another week, right up until Christmas Eve day. I did one last phone interview sitting in the car with a back seat full of presents at the liquor store while my husband bought wine for our family dinner. Things were very quiet until a month or so later when an editor from the New York Times invited me to write an op-ed. She asked, "So, now that this is over, what do you actually want to tell the community about rural life?" For the next 2 months, I found myself writing a much slower piece, a rather personal account of what it's been like to be a homecomer in Fergus Falls for the last 8 years, and why it feels urgent and powerful to commit to this place at this time. Writing it helped me begin to sort out the feelings I had had since the Der Spiegel incident. How many of us, particularly rural women, are walking a confusing tightrope between fighting the narratives that scapegoat our rural neighbors, and when, at the same time, we can easily be discarded and silenced by those same neighbors for questioning and articulating the systems of privilege and power that are dragging our communities down. When I sent in my final draft, I still didn't quite believe it would be published. At my 37-week prenatal checkup, my doctor asked me if I would be writing anymore. I mentioned to him that I had just written an essay for the New York Times and that I was nervous about it being published. "Well," he said, "writing is a type of activism, isn't it?" And he said this as we listened to my baby's heartbeat. The article was published in the Sunday Review that weekend, and then, only 1 week later, my son Ashton arrived. In between the article being published and going into labor, I tried my best to sift through the hundreds of messages I received in response. In some ways, I think my son came early to protect me in that moment and to help me step into my power. Because several people hated my article, but for opposing reasons. I was too liberal and had somehow thrown my community under the bus by writing about our challenges. And I wasn't progressive enough because, being a straight white woman, I was able to move back home and fit right in. One man from New York even mailed me a letter angrily asking why I didn't own up to what rural voters did to our country. But for every criticism, I got a dozen heartfelt messages from other homecomers who shared their stories with me, and those messages reminded me not to apologize for taking the opportunity to use my voice and connect. As I received mixed responses from the community, I also thought about how too often people in my town with incredibly strong convictions are hesitant to speak up about urgent issues. They're afraid of losing friends, donors, or business. And this is understandable. Living and working in rural is a long game. But my hope is that we can think bigger and remember that speaking up is a way to find each other across the abyss. And finally, in the midst of these bigger issues, there's something else that's been on my mind. When I think back on the decision to step back from traditional roles in leadership and write more, I think about how the world responded and told me something. Yes, do that. As William Stafford says in my favorite poem, the darkness around us is deep. These days it can feel like everything and nothing we do matters. All that I know from this experience is that we need all types of leaders right now. But most of all, we need leaders that are charged up by what makes us whole and happy. Not all of us need to run for office to change the world. Some of us can quietly restore a native prairie, or cook food for friends, or write as our activism. Because what makes us happy and awake and alive just might be the loudest thing we can do to get the world to pause and listen and change.
Thank you for listening to that. And my friend Michelle was featured at the Rural Women's Summit as one of our Firestarter speakers. And the idea behind these speakers was this sense that we know that there are so many people who are committed to these small towns and see the promise there. They also see the difficulty and the tensions that exist, and they're working really hard to change the narrative around those things. I was going to share one from Prairie Rose, but I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time to talk, and I will share. So all of these can be found on ruralassembly.org. All of these videos. Prairie Rose is a citizen of the 3 affiliated tribes of North Dakota, and she gives a beautiful testimony about the role that women are playing in native rural communities right now. And then groups from the Youth Assembly. I wanted to make sure that I get to this slide in. This is something that we worked on with our first rural youth cohort in 2010. This idea of asking them to dream big and think about what they want in for their lives, their families, and their lives in rural America. And this is the mission statement they came up with. I'm going to stand in front of it for a second so you don't read it yet. Don't read it yet. So, too late? Okay, is it too late? Well, we're going to read it together, but I just wanted to say it's a terrible idea to ask a room of 50 young people to make a mission statement. That's a hard thing to do, but it turned out to be actually a good idea. What we ended up doing was asking them all to contribute sentences, and we strung them together. And from those sentences came this mission statement. So if you can see it, I'd love for you to read it with me. It says, "We demand of ourselves a proactive and invested community that has quality health care, adequate housing, and enlightened education in a safe and sustainable environment where no person goes thirsty, hungry, or homeless, and every person is accepted no matter who your mama is. All these things done with love tell the story of our future in rural communities." So that came from 50 young people from 35 states from across the country. And that was their vision for growing up and living in a small town. I wanted to suggest that rural America is at a crossroads right now, and we're in need of more leaders to step up, people who've lived there, people who want to return home, people who may just want to create a new life for themselves outside of big urban centers. And I think that crossroads is about how do we make our small towns a sweet spot for the quality of life and for the families that we want to have. I said make McMinn the sweet spot. That's my county. And that's something I'm working on right now with McMinn, city officials and county officials, is how do we build on the assets that we have, the artists we have, the young people we have. And so much of it comes from making sure that we're looking at how do we nourish our families and our young people. And it's something that I believe strongly in. So I'm happy to take questions from you all, to ask questions of you all. I have a couple of questions here if you want to respond to one of them, or if you just have a question for me. But some of the questions I had for you were, do any of these things resonate with you? What maybe surprised you? Do you have something you know about your experience? I kind of want to know if you have the answer to what's the secret sauce to making rural like the next cool place. Yeah,
You mentioned 50,000.
50,000 or below, yeah.
In what area? What? 50,000 per county, 50,000 per state?
Per county, thank you.
50,000 per
Yes,
county?
per county.
Ah, okay. The second question is, what metrics have you used to measure your progress, your organisation?
That's a really good question. So we did a media scan in the last 5 years to see how much rural popped up in national media orgs and how much the media was attributed to local news sources or our news sources or the partners that we worked with, and we found an exponential increase. So the audio, visual, and op-eds and talks that we put out into the world, Center for Rural Strategies and Rural Assembly, that's one of the big ways that we measure our impact. Are we changing the narrative? In the sense that narrative is what drives, or narrative and perception are what drives policy and investment in places. So if we're able to change the narrative, I think we can start to move policy. And then from the policy angle, we do count, how many people do we send to the Hill? Does it result in regulation changes or pushes or new initiatives around specific policy movements? So that's another way we measure it. And how many people are we engaging in our rural leadership kind of gatherings? So the Rural Women's Summit had 250 rural women from 42 states. The Youth Assembly will have 60, this upcoming one will have 60 from 27 states, that kind of thing. Yeah.
You used the term off-grid lifestyles, and I'm not sure what you mean by that, so I was wondering if you could.
Yeah, the question was about off-grid lifestyles. Are anyone else familiar with those? So there are some folks who are finding ways to create their own water sources, electricity sources, and food sources by even disconnecting from all the infrastructure that we depend on, most of us depend on. But in rural places, a lot of that infrastructure is either falling apart or doesn't exist, or it just needs more investment and it's not getting it. So people are finding creative ways to pull the plug and plug it into something else that they've created.
And how do they maintain a sense of community? Because it seems like the whole thing is to get away from people.
Yeah. I can't speak for all of them, but most of them are engaged in it. This act of pulling the plug is connected to a community of practice. They don't feel alone in doing that. So they're connected to others who are doing it, or one woman in New Mexico, she's actually the head of the Makers Conference in her hometown, in her small town. She lives off the grid, but you'll see her at the library every Saturday hosting makers conventions for the small kids that live in that town. So they're still involved, but they're just not. They're creating their own power sources, their own broadband, and a lot of their own food. So it is a very interesting lifestyle. Anybody have thoughts about? I don't know if you still live in a small town. How do you have hard conversations across polarizing topics in this moment? We're so connected as small town people. We've known each other for years, and yet I think that's a hurdle we're struggling with. Any secret sauce about that? Yeah.
I would say Vermont Town Meeting is
Vermont
a very important venue for people to share opinions, differences in a very civil way. At least.
Those are weekly, right?
No,
it's once a year.
Once a year.
Oh, okay.
Last weekend.
Okay,
Yes.
so it was yesterday. I read an article about this in the New York Times, the town meeting, and the headline was something like, "Shut up, David, and let them talk," or something like that. Which is very fun. That's really neat. So there's an annual meeting, and they're run very civilly, I guess. And
Town moderator who's been there for 30 years.
That's right.
Knows everybody by his or her name, and they can take 4 hours to do 10 minutes of business.
Yeah.
That's expected.
Change moves at the pace of trust and relationship is something I'm learning, right? Real change, sustainable change moves at the pace of relationship.
Respect and listening.
Respect and listening. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of avoidance.
Yes.
There are things that we do not talk about because of the schism. Even with people that one may have known for years and years and years. You just don't want to cross that bridge or burn that bridge maybe, because it's a matter of sort of politeness, of living in a town with somebody, next to somebody, whatever, whatever the relationship may be, including within one's own family.
I find that to be very true, and I'm often in this position of, in my small town, of trying to decide, is this the mountain I want to die on? Getting, you know, a liquor store in town, is that the one I'm going to die on, or is it, you know, is it this relationship that I'm really invested in right now? It's very hard. Yeah.
I'd be curious to hear your thoughts right now in this community, and I use that term intentionally. We're struggling with how to plan for our schools going forward. And the challenge there is, what it might mean is small towns have to subsume some of their identities to some larger scale community. Because we have these small primary schools that are getting smaller every year. And the smaller outlying towns feel threatened by the need to kind of give up their school and then lose a bit of themselves to, some would say, serve a sort of bigger benefit. And some would have a totally different read on that.
That's a very common occurrence right now, I think, in small towns across the country, and I think a lot of people are dealing with it in different ways. My hometown, just this year, we've decided to consolidate all of our elementary schools. We have 4 into one big elementary school. And that's been very difficult because people have identified with one small school for generations, maybe. My great-grandmother went to Ingleside Elementary, you know, so this idea that we're going to create this one school is very painful. And something I've learned throughout these conversations is that it's not something that can happen in 8 months or 12 even. It's a long-term conversation that actually began in 2008. We've been having this conversation about consolidation since 2008. So that can be frustrating, and at the same time, that long-term discussion has been actually helpful in accommodating all perspectives in some ways. But it's not easy.
And has your school actually consolidated now?
So now we've passed that, whatever that referendum was, and we've raised the sales tax to pay for the new building, and we're breaking ground in August.
That's all within one municipality.
And the others, and the smaller schools, what happened to them?
So the smaller schools are the ones that, you know, we'll leave behind, will either be raised, or the 2 that are owned by the city are going to be leased to supposedly city-focused efforts, like the Parks and Rec Department, I think, is going to take over one of the schools. And the other one might go to, we have a community college that's not very far away that might have might use that building as a satellite location. So it's
Any community effort to get community activities to reoccur in the building?
early on there was, the question was, is there any community effort to get community activities pushed into those buildings or put in those buildings? And early on there was, but what we learned was that most of them were built in the 1910s or the 1920s or the 1930s. And to bring those buildings up to code for young people or for community activities was just going to be too expensive. So this, we're in these places of very hard decisions where we do need wise and thoughtful and not reactive leadership. And I think that's something that Michelle touched on a little bit, was this idea that, new folks moving back in or people who've grown up there and are, looking to assume leadership. I think pushing back on the status quo has been very difficult, but it's necessary. And it's also possible to overcome I ran for city council in 2016. I didn't win, but I only lost by 200 votes. And I think if I just had another month, I might have like tipped the edge. And I might do it again here soon. So I think, you know, ushering in new leaders for this moment that we're in is important, and it's possible in a small town.
I'm under the impression that a lot of younger people left to go into the military in the last 20 years. Is rural America attracting them back, or have you seen any aspects of that?
The question was, a lot of young people go into the military, a lot of rural young people go into the military, and are they coming back, and are we welcoming them, creating space for them? And that is a new lens, I think, for us. And there are a number of programs that are very intentional about re-recruiting, bringing back people who came from those communities and integrating them back into the community. What's missing, I think, are the health services and mental health services, which are usually about 3 or 4 hours away from our small towns. So they need some rehabilitation, a lot of these soldiers and these veterans, that we're not able to give them right on site. But there's so much pride and love of these veterans, and rural America has a higher percentage rate of veterans in our U.S. military than any other demographic.
This is not really a question, but so there was an editorial in the New York Times a few months ago called "There's Something Special Happening in Rural America." Due to this book by the woman who wrote Heartland.
Yes.
Do you know about this? And it was the concept of the article was like, we all think that like rural America is something to escape from, you could get out, make it, right? And that there's this, but in fact, because of like entrepreneurial affordability and other things, there are these opportunities in rural places. But it's sort of hard to see, right? Because it seems, I don't know, and then Vermont, our population shrinking, of course there's some great stories of entrepreneurship, you know, but mostly it's hard to attract people to come here because of all the constraints and things that you covered. And I guess, I don't know if my question is really just like, is that something that is that really happening on like a significant scale? Is it really just micro movements? Can you track that?
Yeah. Did everybody hear that question? It really is about, I don't know if you've read the book Heartland by Sarah Smarsh, but it's kind of a response to J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy and this idea that rural America is a place where people can come back, have some entrepreneurial spirit, create a life. And is that really the case? I mean, we see in the New York Times op-ed about that. There's a book about that in part. And is that tracking is that really true? It is true. It's not true on a big scale. It's more, it's very, and I would say that part of what the Rural Assembly is trying to do is highlight those people who really are doing that work to elevate that narrative and that perspective, because if that narrative and perspective is elevated, then more people are going to track back in that way. The J.D. Vance Hillbilly Elegy, did anybody read that?
Yes.
Yeah? Yep. I've met J.D. He's a nice guy. It's fine for him to tell his story the way he sees it. I will say that narrative is grounded in some stereotypes about rural places that is not helpful in this moment as we're looking for better policy and more investment and more innovative leadership. That was difficult to be on the bestseller list. But Heartland, if you've read Sarah Smarsh's work, which is really about growing up impoverished in the Midwest, and then finding some reconciliation with that, and also being able to make a go of it in a small town and start covering small towns on the regular as a journalist. That narrative is the one that we need to be promoting for the good of the people who live there, because there's still a rural heartbeat, and also for the nation as a whole, because still rural America is the place that fuels and powers and feeds our nation in a lot of ways. It's also affordable, and it's part of that 80% land mass that we're not utilizing in thoughtful ways.
I have farm roots in Iowa. That's where I trace my connection. One of the most powerful, potentially powerful institutions in the Midwest for some time has been community colleges.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, healthcare is an enormous potential employer for many folks who can't farm or don't wish to go into an agrarian setting. But my question is, do you see things moving forward with community colleges? That is, in terms of training people to find the work that will supplant with livable incomes the kind of loss that agriculture and small-town business is suffering from. So community colleges, I know that the Obama administration hit that drum fairly loudly and attempted to try to promote spending and so on for these colleges. I know they had a tremendous impact on many of my cousins in Iowa who retrained from agriculture to drive trucks, to operate healthcare, become nurses, for instance, and earn livings. I see this in Iowa, but is this something that pervades the rural environment that you see?
It is, and we've done a number of articles in the Daily Yonder about this, the community college phenomenon, and how that could be an engine for better economies, a new future of work, and a way to transition people out of jobs that are fading or dying into new sectors. What I will say is that it's not been so promoted long enough for us to see what the big effects of it are, but I can just tell you in Tennessee, for instance, if you go to a community college, your tuition is free for the first 2 years, for those 2 years, if you want to, and then you can transfer beyond that. But that's a huge deal for rural populations where capital is scarce. The idea of going to college may seem a little bit out of reach, but if you're near a community college and and we need a lot more healthcare workers, so there's a lot of occupational therapy, physical therapy, nursing programs in those. I can only see how those long term, we're going to see good things come out of that.
First, I'd like to say that I actually moved from like metropolis area to a rural area, and I wouldn't go back. I just want to put that out there. But also just that on a small scale in these rural towns, you can make a big difference if you actually step up and do that. And in Poultney, which is only about an hour south, I'm myself as well as some other Green Mountain College graduates are starting a makerspace there.
So cool.
And it's, part of, we all went to Green Mountain and got a 4-year education, but, we're not seeing the return on that, and we're seeing kind of more of how strong the trades are in Vermont in the sense of when you live in a rural environment, you got to know how to be a plumber, an electrician, a woodworker, and everything like that. And so I think that's a big thing as well, is as great as colleges are, and I'm grateful for what I learned at school, I think having more trade programs, especially since they're leaving the high schools in the areas now, so nobody going through high school can learn any of these skills really unless they go to an outside institution. Like there's one in Rutland called Stafford, and in New York there's BOCES and things like that. But I just wanted to kind of say that you really can do a lot, and that's what makes me proud to be here, is that if I was in a big city, the drive and passion I have to try and help what's going on would just be swept to the side and not really noticed. And in a town like Poultney, it's welcomed, and we really have a voice, and I think that that's important in rural communities.
Thank you for that testimony. That's been my experience, and I'd love to talk with you afterwards about writing something. That's really terrific. Yes.
To kind of piggyback on this gentleman's point earlier, and to maybe hit your last bullet point of an act of courage in this moment. I moved to this area like a year and a half ago. I moved up to a little town called Ripton. It's part of the whole school discussions.
Okay.
Prior to that, I I grew up in upstate New York. I've lived in New York City. I've lived in Montana. I've lived in Colorado. And as you know by what's going on in Tennessee, it sounds like school consolidation is kind of, that's the general direction of things right now. And it's very hard to navigate that situation. There's tax repercussions, there's facilities concerns, there's all sorts of different things. Ripton, it's below 1,000 people, so it's small, it's rural. I think, I can't remember the right town report, but I want to say 60-some-odd% of the land is owned by the Forest Service. So it's very
That's
small.
a whole other dynamic.
Yep.
Public land in a small community.
So in terms of density in the town, we're really small. But as far as an act of courage, the town of Ripton has really come together in support of its school. And it hasn't always been perfect. Sometimes people get a little too over-enthusiastic, I would say. But as far as having a community, I've never seen anything like it. I think we're probably up to around 20 letters to the editor. People in this room are probably tired of reading the letters from Ripton. They're like, yeah, this guy should shut up too. But I mean, I'm blown away by the community. I think I feel terribly unfortunate to move to an area where they may close our school, but we are putting up one heck of a fight for it. We'll see where it ends up. And we're fortunate, our most famous resident is Bill McKibben, and he wrote in the New York Times about the general store, which has ice spelled incorrectly on the machine. So we're fortunate enough that some unique little quirks like that. But I have to throw it up to my newly embraced town that we are doing everything we can to keep our small school that people tell me is great. My son's only 3, so I don't know how great it is or not.
And whatever y'all are working on together right now, like I can only imagine what that practice of coming together and the relationships that you're creating and the time you're putting into it, what it's going to yield, like even if it doesn't happen the way you want it to, what that's going to yield down the road. Is really special. I think we're all in this moment of like discernment and trying to figure out what is mine to do. How do I heal my community? How do I heal the world? How do I make a difference? And as you said, in a small place, your presence matters. Every person really counts. Literally, it really matters in a place with small population. So if you're looking for an outlet, then that's the way.
So there's some structural issues we have in Vermont with small towns. Advantages are things like libraries, bookstores, cafes. We have microbreweries everywhere that are wonderful for building community and bringing in young people. But now we have, towns have grocery stores and they're under attack by dollar stores that are moving in and getting rid of all so how do you, even collectively, we can't seem to zone away from this, and we're going to lose a lot of produce and fresh produce and make towns far less livable.
That is so hard. We have 4 Dollar Generals in my little town. We've got 1 library, 1 softball field, and we've got 4 Dollar Generals. So I don't, and a Walmart.
We fought ours.
Yeah.
We won.
You won?
There's
Okay.
no Dollar General in Colby.
Yeah.
Those have been fought here several times.
Okay.
And been successful.
Well, in
What
my
happens now is suppliers refuse to supply small stores because they don't order enough.
Right.
Walmart orders, they give their big orders, but they won't do the local ones.
I do feel like there's only so much we can do turning inward on the local level, that there is a state and national policy discussion that we've got to be involved in to change the way economies are working and the levers that are pulled. I will say that in my small town, one of the ways we push back is that the church that I go to, for instance, and all of our food ministries, we don't buy from Dollar General, we don't buy from Walmart, we buy from the one grocery store that is still family owned, still running, even though it costs, a little bit more to purchase the goods there. On the YMCA board that I'm on, the same thing. All the materials that we buy for our kids programs, they come from, so practicing local economy as you can does matter, but I think there's this state and national policy discussion that's got to be had about how we're killing small places and small businesses.
Do you know of any work that anyone's ever done on like the macroeconomic scale in regards to rural places and how they relate to commodities markets? I mean, it's my understanding that far more money goes through commodities markets than like the stock market. Like you just have a lot more money there. And knowing that all commodities, pretty much except for the stuff that comes from scrap yards, comes from rural places, I've just always wondered if there wasn't work that could be done there so that there's more value put on those commodities that goes back to the places where they come from, whether it's timber, mining, gravel pits, asphalt, concrete, kind of the whole spectrum of things that we need to get by that you have to get from somewhere.
Absolutely, and there are movements built around that. I mean, and a lot of them are regionally focused, so like around coal or, extraction of resources and then money not coming back to small towns. So yes, there are a lot of national groups that work on that. And we have a number of stringers for the Daily Yonder that write for that. So and one of the things that's really great about the Yonder website is you can go to topics, and if you're interested in agriculture, just click on that, and all of our articles and the stringers who work on that are there. Commodities and economy, politics. We have a whole section on rural voters, so if you're interested in rural voting and policy, I don't want to talk about that tonight, but because I'm not the right person for that, but
yeah, because I feel like there's often money for like environmental remediation and stuff after the fact to clean up whatever was removed, but there's nothing that actually comes off of the cost of a product that actually benefits an area, which is a shame.
Yes, we've not heard from you.
Well, I was just thinking about Dollar General in relationship to your statistic earlier that you said that 1 in 3 children in your community lives in poverty. And historically in this community, when there have been battles around things like Walmart coming in, there's definitely a perspective that's voiced about making available to people who don't have money to shop at the kinds of places that we're sort of holding up as the places we should all be shopping. That's a kind of privileged position, and I just wonder what the perspective is. If you have that many people living in poverty in Athens, in some ways it's like a cycle, right?
Yeah,
because people are shopping at Dollar General because they believe that's the only place they can shop, and probably for groceries, not just for plastic junk, right? So it's like there's a fix there there's a kind of activism that your church is practicing or the YMCA is practicing by choosing not to shop there, but then there's also a fix that goes much deeper, right?
I agree, absolutely. Did everybody hear that? There's just that tension between, there's the privileged position of those who don't have to shop at Walmart and Dollar General versus those who do, and how do we engage activism across the board and not harm people who are already being harmed. And then there is this bigger conversation that needs to be had, not just at the local level, but at state and national levels. I don't have the answer to that, but it's something that in a small community we should be better at talking about with each other, because we're in such proximity to wealth disparity, truly.
Really, indigenous communities, the term food sovereignty is something that they have an idea of, and that's about local food grown locally, but also income inequality.
Yeah. It's a great frame, and I forget about that. Sovereignty in food sovereignty and sovereignty in general. It's a really good frame to remember. Oh, I'm so sorry. I've just been okay. Well, it is 20 after 8, and I'm not in charge of. I don't think I'm in charge of the time. I'm happy to